My name is Rebecca Catherine Morrison. I'm 47 years old and I sit on the highest court in the United States of America. When I walk into the Supreme Court building each morning, security guards nod respectfully, clerks straighten their postures, and seasoned attorneys who've argued cases for decades still get nervous when they shake my hand. The marble corridors echo with whispered conversations about precedents I've helped set, decisions that have shaped the constitutional landscape of our nation. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. But to my family back in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I'm still just Becky, the weird one who read too much, the disappointment who chose books over boys, the failure who couldn't even keep a man interested long enough to get married and give them grandchildren they could brag about at church socials. The irony isn't lost on me. I've written majority opinions that legal scholars will study for generations. My constitutional interpretations have been cited in law schools from Harvard to Stanford. Foreign dignitaries seek my counsel on jurisprudence. Yet every Christmas card from home arrives addressed simply to Rebecca Morrison, never Justice Morrison, never the Honorable Rebecca Morrison, as if my life's work, my decades of service to the highest ideals of American justice, simply doesn't exist in their universe. The last time I spoke to my sister Patricia was 3 months ago. She'd called during one of my rare quiet evenings, interrupting my review of cert petitions. Her voice carried that familiar tone of condescending concern that had followed me since childhood. "Rebecca, I saw something about you in the Des Moines Register," she said, her words careful and measured. "Some article about women in leadership or whatever. You know Dad still doesn't understand why you never settled down." I'd been holding a petition regarding Fourth Amendment protections in digital privacy cases, a decision that would affect millions of Americans. But Patricia was worried about my marital status. Again, "I'm doing well, Patricia, thank you for asking." "Are you, though? Really? Because Mom keeps saying you sound tired when you call. Maybe if you'd taken a normal job, found a nice husband, had some kids, lived a real life instead of all this political nonsense." Political nonsense. That's what she called my position on the Supreme Court of the United States. Political nonsense. It's not politics, Patricia. It's constitutional law. Same difference. The point is, you're getting older, Rebecca. You can't keep pretending this career thing is going to make you happy forever. What happens when you retire? You'll be all alone. I'd ended the call shortly after that, but her words lingered like smoke in a closed room. This was the woman who'd spent her adult life managing a small-town beauty salon, whose greatest achievement was organizing the annual church bake sale, telling me that my life lacked meaning. The disconnect runs deeper than career choices. It's foundational, bred into the very DNA of how my family sees the world and my place in it. Growing up in Cedar Falls, success was measured by very specific metrics. Marriage by 25, children by 30, a house with a white picket fence, involvement in the right church committees, and most importantly, staying close to home where everyone could keep an eye on you. I'd violated every one of those unwritten rules. I left for Northwestern University on a full academic scholarship when I was 17, earned my law degree from Yale, clerked for a federal appeals court judge, worked at white shoe law firms in New York and Washington, served as a federal prosecutor, then as a federal judge, and finally received nomination to the Supreme Court when I was 43. Each milestone was met with polite but hollow congratulations from home, followed by questions about when I was going to settle down and start a real family. As if the Constitution I'd sworn to uphold was just a hobby, a phase I'd eventually outgrow once I came to my senses. My parents, Harold and Margaret Morrison, are good people in their own way. Dad spent 40 years managing Morrison Family Hardware, the store his father built and his father before him. Mom raised 4 children, volunteered at the hospital auxiliary, and made the best apple pie in 3 counties. They're respected in Cedar Falls, known for their reliability, their church attendance, their commitment to traditional values. But they never understood me, never even tried to understand me. While my siblings were outside playing or helping in the store, I was curled up in the back corner of the town library, reading everything I could get my hands on. Constitutional law fascinated me from an early age, the elegant balance of powers, the careful construction of rights and responsibilities, the way words on parchment could protect the innocent and constrain the powerful. "She's too serious," Mom would tell the church ladies when they asked about me. "Always has her nose in some book. We keep hoping she'll grow out of it." But I never grew out of it. If anything, I grew deeper into it, understanding that law wasn't just academic theory but the foundation upon which a free society stands. While other kids were memorizing song lyrics, I was memorizing amendments. While they were learning to drive, I was learning to construct legal arguments. While they were going to prom, I was participating in mock trial competitions. Motigay, my siblings found their paths early and stayed on them. Patricia married her high school sweetheart Tommy Chen right after graduation, took over Mom's spot in the church choir, and had 3 children before she turned 25. Michael took over the hardware store from Dad and married a nice local girl named Sarah who teaches 2nd grade. Jennifer became a nurse at the county hospital and married a police officer named Rick. All of them stayed within a 20-mile radius of where they were born. All of them had children who call Harold and Margaret Grandpa and Grandma, with genuine affection. All of them reinforced my parents' worldview that success meant staying close, staying conventional, staying safe. And then there was me, the outlier, the one who left, the one who chose ambition over comfort, achievement over acceptance. They watch my life from a distance, like anthropologists studying some exotic culture they can't quite comprehend. When news of my Supreme Court nomination made national headlines, the local paper ran a small story buried on page 6. Cedar Falls native nominated to High Court. Not the front page. Not a celebration, just a brief acknowledgement that someone from their town had done something noteworthy, though they weren't quite sure what to make of it. The confirmation hearings were brutal, as they always are. Senators grilled me for hours about my judicial philosophy, my past decisions, my interpretation of constitutional principles. Cable news networks analyzed every word I spoke, every expression that crossed my face. Legal experts debated whether I was qualified, whether I was too liberal or too conservative, whether I represented the right kind of justice for the times. My family watched none of it. Patricia later told me she'd tried to find it on TV but couldn't figure out which channel it was on and gave up after 15 minutes. "It looked boring anyway," she said. "Just a bunch of old men asking you questions. Old men asking questions." That's how she described the constitutional vetting process for the highest judicial office in our democracy. The day my confirmation was announced, I received congratulations from colleagues, from law school classmates, from judges I'd worked with, from senators who'd voted for me. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from people who understood the magnitude of the moment, who recognized what this appointment meant not just for me but for the institution itself. From my family, I received a single text message from Mom. "Congratulations, honey. Dad says to tell you he's proud. Are you coming home for Christmas?" That was it. No acknowledgement of the historical nature of the appointment. No recognition of the decades of work it had taken to reach this point. No understanding that I'd just become one of only 9 people in the entire country entrusted with interpreting the Constitution. Just a question about Christmas dinner. The worst part wasn't their indifference to my achievements. It was their active disappointment in my choices. At family gatherings, conversation would inevitably turn to my situation, their euphemism for my unmarried, childless state. Cousins would share photos of their children's soccer games and piano recitals. Aunts would coo over new babies. And eventually, someone would turn to me with that look of sympathetic concern. "So, Rebecca, are you seeing anyone special? Any prospects on the horizon? You know, my neighbor's son is a lawyer too, very nice boy. I could give you his number." As if my problem was simply a lack of introductions. As if I'd spent decades building a legal career because I hadn't met the right man to rescue me from my ambitions. They'd never ask about my work directly, but sometimes I'd catch fragments of conversations about me when they thought I wasn't listening. Words like stubborn and too picky, and married to her job. Once I overheard my aunt telling Mom that I was too intimidating for most men, and that maybe I should tone it down a little if I wanted to find happiness. Tone it down. Diminish myself. Make my achievements smaller so others would feel more comfortable around me. That was their solution to my supposed loneliness. Not celebrating my success, but asking me to hide it. The Supreme Court building feels more like home to me than the house I grew up in. The weight of history in those chambers, the gravity of the decisions we make, the knowledge that our words will outlive us all, that gives my life meaning in ways my family has never understood. When I'm writing an opinion, when I'm questioning attorneys during oral arguments, when I'm wrestling with the constitutional implications of a complex case, I feel connected to something larger than myself, something that matters beyond the boundaries of Cedar Falls, Iowa. But late at night, in the quiet of my Georgetown townhouse, surrounded by legal treatises and case files, I sometimes wonder what it would be like to have family members who understood what I do, who appreciated the significance of the work, who could share in the pride of these accomplishments, instead of treating them as obstacles to my real happiness. I wonder what it would be like to call home with news of a major decision and have them ask thoughtful questions about the legal reasoning instead of changing the subject to ask when I'm going to visit. I wonder what it would be like to have their respect instead of their pity. But I've learned to find validation elsewhere, in the law itself, in the knowledge that my decisions help protect rights and freedoms for people who will never know my name, in the quiet satisfaction of serving something greater than family expectations or social conventions. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Still, there's an ache that never quite goes away, a hollow space where unconditional family support should be. It's the price I've paid for choosing excellence over acceptance, for building a life that matters beyond the narrow confines of what my family considers normal. Little did I know that price was about to increase dramatically, and that everything I'd built, my reputation, my career, my very sense of self, was about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by certified mail to my chambers at the Supreme Court. My secretary, Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, brought it in with the morning's correspondence, her usual efficient smile faltering slightly when she saw the return address. "Justice Morrison, this one requires your personal signature," she said, placing the thick manila envelope on top of the stack of cert petitions I'd been reviewing. "It's from Whitfield & Associates in Cedar Falls, Iowa." I recognized the name immediately. Whitfield & Associates was the only law firm in Cedar Falls, a two-partner practice that handled everything from property disputes to divorce proceedings. The fact that they were sending me certified mail could only mean one thing: family trouble. My hands remained steady as I signed the receipt, but something cold settled in my stomach. Mrs. Hayes lingered for a moment, her maternal instincts clearly picking up on the tension. But I dismissed her with a polite nod. Some conversations require absolute privacy, and I had a feeling this was going to be one of them. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted with more than just paper and legal documents. I set it aside while I finished reviewing a complex First Amendment case. But my concentration was fractured. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted to that manila envelope, sitting there like an unexploded bomb. It was nearly noon when I finally opened it, using the silver letter opener that had been a gift from my law school mentor. Inside was a formal legal complaint, meticulously typed on cream-colored letterhead, along with a cover letter from James Whitfield himself. The complaint named me as a defendant in a civil lawsuit. The plaintiff was my sister Patricia Chen, represented by Whitfield & Associates. The allegations were stunning in their audacity and devastating in their implications. Financial elder abuse, undue influence over a vulnerable adult, and fraudulent manipulation of our father's medical care decisions. According to the documents, Patricia was seeking to have me removed as Dad's power of attorney, claiming that I had been using my position of authority and influence to coerce him into making financial decisions that benefited me at the expense of the rest of the family. She alleged that I had pressured him into changing his will, manipulated him into selling the family hardware store to fund my lavish lifestyle, and had been systematically isolating him from his other children. Every word was a lie, but they were lies wrapped in legal language, presented with the kind of formal gravity that could destroy reputations and end careers. The document painted a picture of me as a calculating predator who had used my legal expertise to take advantage of an aging parent's confusion and dependency. The cover letter from Whitfield was almost worse than the complaint itself. Written in the folksy, down-home style that small-town lawyers often employ when they want to sound both reasonable and threatening, it suggested that this could all be resolved quietly if I would simply step aside and allow Patricia to handle Dad's affairs. "Given your prominent position in our nation's highest court," Whitfield had written, "I'm sure you understand the importance of avoiding any appearance of impropriety. A quiet resolution of this family matter would be in everyone's best interests, particularly your own. The implied threat was clear. Comply or face a very public legal battle that would inevitably draw media attention to a sitting Supreme Court justice accused of elder abuse. The timing was particularly vicious. We were in the middle of a contentious term with several high-profile cases pending that would define my legacy on the court. I read through the entire complaint twice, my legal training automatically analyzing the structure of the arguments, the strength of the allegations, the potential defenses. From a purely professional standpoint, it was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, just credible enough to cause serious damage, just vague enough to be difficult to disprove quickly. But from a personal standpoint, it was devastating. These weren't just legal allegations, they were character assassinations. Patricia wasn't just challenging my authority as Dad's power of attorney. She was attacking the very foundation of who I was as a person and as a jurist. The most painful part was the grain of truth buried within the lies. Yes, I had Dad's power of attorney, because he had asked me to take it when his arthritis made it difficult for him to manage his own paperwork. Yes, he had sold the hardware store, because he was 78 years old and no longer physically capable of running it, and because Michael had shown no interest in taking over the business. Yes, I had been involved in his medical decisions, because I was the only one in the family with the education and experience to understand complex medical and legal documents. But Patricia had twisted each of these facts into something sinister, something calculating. In her version of events, my education became a weapon, my success became evidence of greed, my willingness to help became proof of manipulation. The worst allegation was buried in paragraph 17. Defendant has used her position as a federal judge to intimidate medical professionals and financial advisors into compliance with her demands, creating an atmosphere of fear and coercion around the vulnerable elder's care. This was the nuclear option, the allegation that could end my career even if it was eventually disproven. The mere suggestion that I had abused my judicial authority for personal gain was the kind of scandal that destroys Supreme Court justices. It didn't matter that it was false. What mattered was that it would be investigated, reported, analyzed, and forever attached to my name. I set the documents down and walked to the window of my chambers, looking out at the Capitol dome gleaming in the afternoon sun. From this vantage point, I could see tourists on the Supreme Court steps, many of them taking photos, some holding signs supporting various causes. They came here because they believed in something, in justice, in the rule of law, in the idea that truth eventually prevails. But they didn't understand what I was beginning to learn, that sometimes the law can be used as a weapon against the very people who serve it most faithfully. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown Iowa number. Saw the news about your legal troubles. Maybe now you'll understand what the rest of us have been trying to tell you all these years. Come home and we'll figure this out. Patricia. What news? I hadn't told anyone about the lawsuit. My heart began racing as I opened my laptop and searched for my name in the news. The results made my blood run cold. Supreme Court Justice Morrison, named in elder abuse lawsuit. Cedar Falls Gazette. Family feud. High Court Justice accused of financial manipulation. Iowa State Press. Morrison family drama reaches federal court. Des Moines Register. The story was already spreading beyond Iowa. Within hours, national outlets would pick it up. By evening, it would be on cable news. By tomorrow, it would be analyzed by legal experts, political commentators, and court watchers across the country. The Cedar Falls Gazette article was particularly brutal, featuring a photo of Patricia looking tearful and concerned next to a picture of me in my judicial robes, looking stern and intimidating. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. The caring local daughter versus the powerful, distant federal judge who had forgotten her roots. Patricia Chen, a longtime Cedar Falls resident and local business owner, filed the complaint yesterday in Polk County District Court, the article read. Chen alleges that her sister, Supreme Court Justice Rebecca Morrison, has been using her legal expertise and federal position to manipulate their elderly father's financial and medical decisions. The article included quotes from Patricia that I had never heard before, statements that revealed a depth of resentment I hadn't fully understood. Rebecca left here 30 years ago and never looked back. She comes home maybe twice a year, stays for a day or two, and then disappears back to Washington. But suddenly, when Dad needs help, She swoops in and takes control of everything. She has power of attorney, she's making all the medical decisions, she sold his business without consulting any of us. We don't even know what's happening to our own father. There was more. I think Rebecca has forgotten that she's not a queen. She can't just make decisions for other people's lives because she wears a black robe. This is about family, not federal court, and family means all of us have a say. The article also included a statement from James Whitfield. This is a deeply unfortunate situation involving a family that's been torn apart by one member's abuse of power. We're confident that when all the facts come to light, the court will see that our client's concerns are completely justified. Reading these words, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my confirmation hearings. The sick, helpless feeling of watching my reputation being systematically destroyed by people who understood exactly how to inflict maximum damage. But there was something else in that feeling, something that took me a moment to identify. It was a relief. After decades of pretending that my family's indifference didn't hurt, after years of making excuses for their lack of support, after countless holidays spent feeling like an outsider in my own childhood home, the mask had finally been ripped away. This wasn't about Dad's care or his finances or his medical decisions. This was about 30 years of accumulated resentment finally finding a legal outlet. This was about a family that had never forgiven me for leaving, for succeeding, for becoming someone they couldn't understand or control. Patricia wasn't trying to protect Dad. She was trying to punish me. And she had chosen the one weapon that could actually hurt me. The suggestion that I had corrupted the very principles I had dedicated my life to upholding. I picked up my secure phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. It rang 3 times before Dad answered, his voice thin but clear. Dad? It's Rebecca. I just received some legal documents from Patricia's lawyer. There was a long pause, then a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. Patricia said she was going to do this, but I hoped she'd come to her senses. Dad, did you know she was filing this lawsuit? Another pause. She's been talking about it for months, ever since I gave you the power of attorney. She thinks I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Do you want me to step aside? If you want Patricia to handle your affairs, I'll transfer everything to her right now. Rebecca. His voice was firmer now, more like the father I remembered from childhood. I gave you that power of attorney because you're the only one I trust to do what's right, not what's easy. Patricia means well, but she doesn't understand. She doesn't understand that sometimes doing the right thing means making hard choices. This is gonna get ugly, Dad. Very ugly. The press is already covering it. Let them. I'm 78 years old, and I'm not afraid of my own daughter. The question is, are you going to let them scare you into backing down? For the first time since opening that envelope, I smiled. This was the Dad I remembered. The one who had taught me to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. He might not understand my career, might not appreciate my achievements, but he still believed in the principles that had shaped both of us. No, Dad, I'm not backing down. Good. Then let's show them what Morrisons are made of. As I hung up the phone, I realized that everything had changed. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore, it was a war. And unlike previous family conflicts that I could escape by returning to Washington, this one was following me here, into my chambers, into my career, into the very heart of who I was. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was fighting alongside my father instead of against my family's expectations. Whatever happened next, at least I wouldn't be facing it alone. The hostility didn't begin when I left for Northwestern. It started much earlier, when I was 12 years old and Patricia was 15. That was the year our family dynamic crystallized into a pattern that would define our relationships for decades to come. It was the spring of 1988, and I had just won the Iowa State Middle School Mock Trial Championship. Our team from Cedar Falls had beaten schools from Des Moines, Ames, and even some high school teams that had been allowed to compete in a special exhibition round. For a 12-year-old from a town of 8,000 people, it felt like conquering the world. I remember rushing home with the trophy, a golden gavel mounted on a marble base, bursting through the front door of our house on Maple Street, with the kind of excitement only children can muster. Mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Dad was reading the evening paper in his recliner, and Patricia was on the phone with her boyfriend Tommy as usual. "Mom, Dad, we won! We won the whole state championship!" I practically shouted, holding up the trophy like it was the Stanley Cup. Mom looked up from the pot roast she was seasoning, smiled warmly, and said, "That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud of you." But before she could say anything else, Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway, having ended her phone call with an abrupt goodbye. "What's all the screaming about?" she asked, eyeing the trophy with immediate suspicion. "Rebecca won some kind of debate thing," Mom explained, returning her attention to dinner. "State champions." Patricia's expression shifted in a way I didn't understand at the time but would come to recognize as a very specific kind of calculation. She was measuring, evaluating, determining how this development affected her position in the family hierarchy. "Mock trial," I corrected, still breathless with excitement. "We argued a case about constitutional rights and—" "Constitutional rights?" Patricia interrupted, her voice carrying a note of incredulity that seemed disproportionate to the conversation. "Rebecca, you're 12. You don't even know what those words mean." "I do too. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizure, and the Fifth Amendment—" "Oh my God, you sound like a robot," Patricia said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "No wonder you don't have any friends." The comment hit like a physical blow. It was cruel in the way that only siblings can be cruel, finding exactly the right weakness to exploit. Because she was right. I didn't have many friends. While other kids my age were focused on slumber parties and shopping at the mall, I spent my free time in the library reading about landmark Supreme Court cases. "Patricia, that's enough," Mom said, but her tone was weary rather than stern, as if this was a familiar script she was tired of performing. "I'm just saying, it's not normal for a kid to be obsessed with law stuff. It's weird. And now she's going to be impossible to live with because she won some little trophy." Dad looked up from his newspaper for the first time since I'd come home. "Let me see that trophy, Becky." I handed it to him proudly, watching as he examined it with the same careful attention he gave to everything. Turning it over in his hands, reading the inscription, weighing its significance. "Iowa State Mock Trial Champions," he read aloud. "That's quite an accomplishment. How many schools competed?" 47, I said, my excitement returning despite Patricia's dismissiveness. Dad nodded approvingly. 47 schools. That's impressive." But then he set the trophy on the coffee table and returned to his newspaper. The conversation effectively over. Rebbe Yod. That night at dinner, the dynamics became even clearer. Patricia dominated the conversation with stories about her cheerleading practice, her plans for junior prom, and the latest drama involving which girls were dating which boys. Mom and Dad engaged enthusiastically, asking follow-up questions, laughing at her stories, offering advice about dress colors and curfew negotiations. When I tried to share details about the mock trial, the complexity of the case we'd argued, the legal precedents we'd researched, the strategy we'd developed, their responses were polite but distant. They asked perfunctory questions, nodded at appropriate intervals, but their eyes glazed over in a way that made it clear they didn't understand what I was talking about and weren't particularly interested in learning. "So what does this mean exactly?" Mom finally asked. "Do you get to go to some other competition now?" "No. This was the final competition. But our coach, Mrs. Henderson, thinks I should consider law as a career someday. She says I have a natural ability for legal reasoning." Patricia snorted. "Legal reasoning? Rebecca, you're in 7th grade. You should be thinking about normal things, like what you're going to wear to the 8th grade dance, not planning your career." "There's nothing wrong with having goals," Dad said mildly, but his tone suggested he agreed that I was getting ahead of myself. "Goals are fine," Patricia continued, warming to her theme. "But realistic goals? Becky acts like she's going to be some kind of famous lawyer or something. It's embarrassing." "I might be," I said quietly, surprising myself with my boldness. The table went silent. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that I couldn't decipher at the time but would later recognize as concern mixed with something approaching pity. "Honey," Mom said gently, "it's wonderful that you're doing well in school. But you have to understand that there's a big difference between winning a competition in Cedar Falls and, well, what you're talking about." What do you mean? She means, Patricia said, her voice taking on that particular tone of condescending patience that older siblings perfect, that people like us don't become Supreme Court justices, or whatever you're dreaming about. We're not that kind of people. What kind of people are we? I asked, genuinely confused. Dad set down his fork and looked at me seriously. We're good people, Becky. Honest people. We work hard. We take care of our families. We contribute to our community. That's what matters. Not chasing after things that are beyond our reach. But why are they beyond our reach? Because, Patricia said, exasperation creeping into her voice, we live in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Our dad runs a hardware store. Our mom volunteers at the church. We're normal, regular people. We don't have the connections or the money or the background for those kinds of careers. Looking back, I can see that this conversation was the moment when my family's worldview was fully revealed to me. They weren't trying to be cruel. They were trying to protect me from disappointment. In their understanding of how the world worked, success had predetermined limits, and those limits were defined by geography, class, and social connections. They believed that ambition beyond those limits wasn't inspiring. It was delusional. They thought they were being loving by trying to redirect my dreams toward more realistic goals. They couldn't conceive that their 12-year-old daughter might actually possess the intelligence and determination to transcend those limitations. But their protective instincts felt like rejection to me. Every time they suggested I focus on normal things, I heard that my interests weren't worthy of respect. Every time they cautioned me against unrealistic expectations, I heard that they didn't believe in my abilities. Every time they redirected conversations away from my academic achievements, I heard that my successes didn't matter to them. The pattern established that night persisted through my teenage years. When I was named valedictorian of my high school class, the conversation at dinner focused on whether my graduation dress was appropriate. When I received a full scholarship to Northwestern, they worried about me being so far from home rather than celebrating the achievement. When I was accepted to Yale Law School, they questioned whether I was sure I wanted to take on that much student debt. Patricia, meanwhile, was celebrated for every conventional milestone. Her engagement to Tommy was treated like a royal wedding, with months of planning and excitement. Her pregnancy announcements were met with tears of joy and immediate discussions about baby showers and nursery decorations. Her decision to take over management of the local beauty salon was praised as showing real entrepreneurial spirit. The message was clear. Conformity was rewarded, distinction was suspect. Following the expected path brought approval. Blazing your own trail brought concern and gentle discouragement. Michael and Jennifer, my younger siblings, learned this lesson well. Michael showed early aptitude for mechanical work and was steered toward taking over the family hardware store, a suggestion he embraced with visible relief. Jennifer's interest in helping injured animals was channeled toward nursing, a career that was both respectable and safely conventional. But I couldn't make myself fit into their prescribed molds, and my continued success in academics only widened the gulf between my aspirations and their expectations. By the time I graduated from high school, family gatherings had become exercises in polite disconnection. They would ask about my grades, I would share my achievements, and they would respond with the kind of forced enthusiasm usually reserved for children's finger paintings. The breaking point came during my sophomore year at Northwestern, when I called home to share news that I had been selected for a prestigious internship with a federal appeals court judge in Chicago. It was an incredible opportunity that would give me first-hand experience in the federal court system and likely help secure my admission to top law schools. "That's nice, dear," Mom said when I finished explaining the internship. "But you'll still be able to come home for Christmas, won't you?" It was such a complete misunderstanding of what I had accomplished that I found myself speechless. I had just been chosen from hundreds of applicants for an opportunity that could shape my entire career, and her primary concern was whether it would interfere with holiday plans. "Mom, this is a really big deal. This judge only takes one intern per year and—" "I'm sure it is, honey. Your father and I are very proud. But you know how much Christmas means to our family." That's when I realized that they would never understand. It wasn't that they were incapable of understanding. It was that my achievements existed in a realm so far outside their experience that they had no framework for processing their significance. To them, a federal internship was just another school activity, like debate club or student government, something that might be nice to put on a resume, but certainly nothing that should interfere with family traditions. Patricia's reaction was even more telling. When I mentioned the internship during our next phone conversation, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Wow, Rebecca, you really are determined to make the rest of us look bad, aren't you?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, some of us are trying to build normal lives here, and then you call up with these stories about federal judges and prestigious internships. It makes everyone else feel like what we're doing doesn't matter." "That's not what I'm trying to do at all. Maybe not intentionally, but that's the effect. Every time you accomplish something, it's like you're proving that staying in Cedar Falls was the wrong choice. Like you're better than the rest of us." This was the core of the resentment that would define our relationship for the next 25 years. My success wasn't just personal achievement, it was perceived as judgment on their choices. My ambition wasn't admirable determination, it was arrogant rejection of family values. My career wasn't something to celebrate. It was evidence that I considered myself superior to them, and perhaps most painfully, they weren't entirely wrong. As the years passed and my achievements mounted, I did begin to feel that I had made better choices than my siblings. I did sometimes look at their small-town lives and wonder how they could be satisfied with so little ambition. I did occasionally catch myself feeling impatient with their concerns about church committees and school board elections when I was dealing with constitutional questions that affected millions of people. But that sense of superiority was born from their rejection, not the cause of it. I wouldn't have developed those feelings if they had celebrated my achievements instead of minimizing them, if they had asked thoughtful questions about my work instead of changing the subject, if they had treated my career as something worthy of respect instead of something that threatened their own sense of self-worth. By the time I was nominated to the Supreme Court, the patterns were so deeply entrenched that even this unprecedented honor couldn't break through them. Patricia's response to my nomination was telling. "I suppose this means you'll never have time for family now." Not congratulations, not pride, not amazement at what her sister had accomplished. Just another expression of the central grievance that had poisoned our relationship for decades. That my success was somehow an attack on them, that my achievements came at the expense of family loyalty, that choosing excellence over conformity was fundamentally selfish. Now with this lawsuit, all those years of accumulated resentment had found their perfect expression. Patricia wasn't just trying to take control of Dad's affairs. She was trying to prove what she had believed all along, that my success was built on manipulation and self-interest, that beneath the impressive titles and achievements, I was still just selfish Becky who thought she was better than everyone else. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. She had assumed that my desire to avoid family conflict would make me back down, that my concern for my reputation would force me to settle quietly. She didn't understand that some principles are worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. And she certainly didn't understand that 30 years of being underestimated by my own family had taught me exactly how to fight battles that everyone expected me to lose. The war room I assembled wasn't in some prestigious DC law firm or government building. It was the spare bedroom of my Georgetown townhouse, transformed overnight into a command center that would have impressed my former colleagues at the Justice Department. Federal judges don't usually have to defend themselves in civil litigation, but Supreme Court justices definitely don't represent themselves in family disputes that have gone public. I needed the best legal representation money could buy, and I needed it fast. But more importantly, I needed lawyers who understood that this case wasn't really about elder abuse or financial manipulation. This was about destroying a Supreme Court justice's reputation using the legal system as a weapon. My first call was to Marcus Webb at Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most respected litigation partners in the country. Marcus had argued before the Supreme Court 17 times, had never lost a case involving judicial ethics, and more importantly, owed me a favor from when I was a federal prosecutor, and had helped him navigate a particularly complex white-collar defense. "Rebecca, I heard about the Iowa situation," Marcus said before I could even explain why I was calling. "CNN's been running segments about it all morning. This is serious." "How serious?" Serious enough that 3 senators have already called for an ethics investigation. Serious enough that the Chief Justice's office has been fielding calls from reporters asking if you're going to recuse yourself from pending cases. Serious enough that someone leaked your financial disclosure forms to the Washington Post. My blood chilled. Financial disclosure forms for Supreme Court justices are public record, but they're usually buried in government archives where only the most dedicated researchers bother to look. Someone had done the legwork to dig them up and hand them to reporters, which meant this attack was more coordinated than I had initially realized. What do the forms show? Nothing damaging, which is probably frustrating whoever leaked them. You live modestly for someone in your position, your investments are properly disclosed, and there's no evidence of any financial impropriety. But that's not the point. What is the point? The point is that someone is conducting opposition research on a sitting Supreme Court justice, and they're feeding information to the media in a way that maximizes damage. This isn't just your sister being angry, Rebecca. Someone with resources and sophistication is orchestrating this campaign. That revelation changed everything. Patricia might have filed the lawsuit, but she didn't have the knowledge or connections to coordinate a media strategy. Someone else was pulling strings. Someone who understood how to destroy political figures using a combination of legal pressure and public relations warfare. Marcus, I need you to represent me in the Iowa case. I'd be honored. But Rebecca, you need to understand what you're walking into. If we fight this aggressively, every detail of your family history is going to be examined under a microscope. Every conversation with your father, every financial transaction, every decision you've made regarding his care, it's all going to be scrutinized by opposing counsel, reported in the media, and analyzed by talking heads on cable news. And if I don't fight, then you'll spend the rest of your career on the Supreme Court under a cloud of suspicion. Every decision you make will be viewed through the lens of these allegations. Your legacy will be defined not by your judicial opinions, but by whether people believe you're the kind of person who would abuse an elderly parent. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I had spent 3 decades building a reputation for integrity and judicial excellence. I wasn't going to let it be destroyed by lies, regardless of who was spreading them. Set up a meeting with your litigation team. I want to begin discovery immediately. While Marcus assembled his team, I began my own investigation. 30 years of federal service had taught me that information is the most powerful weapon in any legal battle, and I intended to gather as much as possible before Patricia's lawyers knew what hit them. My first stop was Cedar Falls itself. I took a red-eye flight to Des Moines, rented an unremarkable sedan, and drove the hour and a half to my hometown without telling anyone I was coming. The element of surprise would be crucial for what I had planned. Cedar Falls looked exactly as I remembered it, frozen in amber like a postcard from 1985. Main Street still featured the same mix of family-owned businesses and empty storefronts. The courthouse still dominated the town square with its limestone facade and Civil War monument. Morrison Family Hardware still occupied the corner building where it had operated for 3 generations. But I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was there to document the truth about Dad's condition, his decision-making capacity, and the circumstances surrounding his decision to grant me power of attorney. My first stop was Dr. Elizabeth Kovac's office. Dr. Kovac had been Dad's physician for 15 years, and her medical records would be crucial in establishing his mental competency. But more importantly, she was known for her meticulous documentation and her unwillingness to be intimidated by lawyers or family pressure. "Justice Morrison," she said when I appeared in her waiting room, using my title with the kind of respect I never heard from my own family. "I was wondering when you'd come to see me." "Dr. Kovac, I need to understand what Patricia has been telling you about Dad's condition." She gestured toward her office, closing the door behind us with deliberate care. "Your sister has been calling regularly for the past 6 months, expressing concerns about your father's mental state. She's suggested that he's showing signs of dementia, that he's easily confused, that he might be susceptible to manipulation. And what do your examinations show?" Dr. Kovac opened a thick file folder. "Your father is sharp as a tack, Justice Morrison. His cognitive function tests are excellent for a man his age. His memory is intact, his judgment is sound, and he demonstrates clear understanding of complex concepts. If anything, he's become more decisive in recent years, not less." Has Patricia requested copies of his medical records? "Multiple times." But your father specifically instructed me not to release any information to family members without his explicit written consent. He said, and I quote, "Patricia means well, but she thinks I'm senile just because I'm old. Don't give her ammunition to prove something that isn't true." This was exactly the kind of evidence I needed, but it also revealed something troubling. Patricia had been laying groundwork for this lawsuit for months, systematically building a case based on allegations she knew were false. My next stop was First National Bank of Cedar Falls, where Dad had conducted his financial business for 40 years. The bank president, Robert Chen, no relation to Patricia despite the shared surname, had known our family since childhood and had personally handled Dad's accounts during the transition of the hardware store sale. "Rebecca, good to see you," he said, though his expression suggested he was uncomfortable with the circumstances. "I suppose you're here about Patricia's concerns. What concerns has she expressed to you?" "She's been asking questions about your father's financial decisions, particularly the sale of the hardware store and his decision to liquidate some investments. She suggested that he might not have understood the implications of those decisions." "And what's your professional assessment?" Chen pulled out a file that was even thicker than Dr. Kovacs. "Your father understood every detail of every transaction. He asked sophisticated questions about tax implications, inheritance planning, and long-term care costs. He specifically mentioned that he wanted to simplify his finances to make things easier for whoever would eventually handle his affairs." "Did he mention me specifically?" "Yes. He said he was giving you power of attorney because you were the only one in the family with the education and experience to handle complex financial and legal matters properly. He was quite adamant about it, actually. Said Patricia was a good daughter but that she didn't understand the difference between a trust fund and a checking account." I couldn't help but smile at that. It sounded exactly like something Dad would say. Blunt but not unkind, focused on practical realities rather than hurt feelings. "Robert, I need copies of all transaction records for the past 2 years, and I need documentation of every conversation Dad had with bank personnel regarding these decisions." "Already prepared," he said, handing me a bound folder. "When Patricia started making allegations, I figured someone would eventually want the real story." As I drove between these meetings, I began to see the outline of Patricia's strategy. She had spent months building a narrative of Dad's declining mental capacity and my alleged manipulation, but she had made a crucial error. She had assumed that small-town professionals would be intimidated by legal pressure and reluctant to contradict a local family's version of events. What she hadn't counted on was that these same professionals had their own reputations to protect, and they weren't willing to participate in what they recognized as a coordinated attack on someone who had brought honor to their community. My final stop was the most important and the most difficult, a conversation with Dad himself. He was waiting for me in the kitchen of his house on Maple Street, a pot of coffee already brewed, and 2 cups set out on the table like he knew I was coming. "Figured you'd show up eventually," he said, embracing me with a hug that was stronger than I expected. "Patricia's been stirring up quite a hornet's nest." "Dad, I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you understand what Patricia is alleging? Do you understand what this lawsuit could do to my career?" He sat down heavily, his arthritis making the movement painful, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Rebecca, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. Patricia thinks I don't know what she's doing, but I've been watching her set this up for months." "Set it up how?" The phone calls to Dr. Kovac, asking about my mental state. The visits to the bank, questioning my decisions. The conversations with neighbors about how worried she is about my welfare. She's been building a case, just like you used to do when you were a prosecutor. This confirmation was both relieving and terrifying. Dad understood exactly what was happening, which proved his mental competency. But it also meant that Patricia's campaign had been even more calculated than I had realized. "Dad, why didn't you tell me what she was doing?" "Because I wanted to see how far she'd go, and because I figured you were smart enough to figure it out on your own." He reached across the table and patted my hand. "Rebecca, I may not understand everything about your job, but I understand enough to know that you've dedicated your life to fighting for what's right. I'm not going to let Patricia destroy that just because she's jealous of what you've accomplished. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Are you prepared for that? Honey, I've been dealing with Patricia's tantrums for 43 years. I think I can handle whatever she throws at us." As I flew back to Washington that night, my briefcase filled with medical records, financial documents, and sworn statements, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my confirmation hearings: absolute confidence in the righteousness of my position. Patricia had spent months building her case on a foundation of lies and half-truths, but I had spent 2 days gathering an overwhelming arsenal of facts. She had assumed that her local connections would give her an advantage, but those same connections had provided me with evidence that would demolish her allegations. But more importantly, I had something Patricia didn't expect: the support of the one person whose opinion mattered most in this fight. Dad wasn't just going to defend me, he was going to fight alongside me. The war was far from over, but for the first time since receiving that certified letter, I believed we could win. The Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines was a far cry from the marble grandeur of the Supreme Court building, but it possessed its own kind of dignity. Built in the 1960s with clean lines and functional architecture, it represented the workmanlike approach to justice that characterized state courts across America. This was where real people brought real problems, where family disputes and business conflicts and personal grievances were settled with less ceremony but no less gravity than the constitutional questions I usually confronted. I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled hearing, not because I needed the extra time, but because I wanted to observe the battlefield. Marcus Webb and his team had flown in from New York the night before, and they were already seated at the defendant's table, reviewing final preparations with the kind of meticulous attention that justified their astronomical hourly rates. The media presence was overwhelming. Camera crews from CNN, Fox News, and all 3 networks had set up outside the courthouse. Inside, the gallery was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and curious onlookers who had driven from across Iowa to witness what cable news was calling the most significant judicial ethics case in a generation. But it was the presence of my family that truly unsettled me. Patricia sat at the plaintiff's table with James Whitfield, looking every inch the concerned daughter in a navy blue dress and pearl earrings that our grandmother had given her for her wedding. Michael and Jennifer flanked her in the front row, their expressions carefully neutral but their positioning unmistakably supportive. Mom sat alone in the 3rd row, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of the kind of stoic resignation she had perfected during 40 years of marriage to a stubborn man and 30 years of raising strong-willed children. She caught my eye briefly as I entered the courtroom, and I saw something that might have been an apology, or perhaps just exhaustion. Dad was nowhere to be seen, which surprised me until I remembered that he was scheduled to testify later in the proceedings. Patricia's legal team had apparently decided to present their case first, building their narrative of manipulation and abuse before giving the alleged victim a chance to speak for himself. Judge Margaret Sullivan entered the courtroom with the kind of brisk efficiency that suggested she had reviewed every document in the case file and was ready to get to the heart of the matter. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her mid-40s, with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent years separating truth from theatrics in family court. This case, she began after calling the court to order, involves serious allegations of elder abuse and financial manipulation. Given the prominent position of the defendant and the public interest in these proceedings, I want to make clear that this court will be guided solely by evidence and law, not by personalities or politics. Her eyes found mine for just a moment, and I recognized something familiar in her expression: the look of a female judge who had spent her career proving that she belonged in a system dominated by men. She would bend over backward to avoid any appearance of favoritism toward me, which meant I needed to win this case on the merits, not on professional courtesy. James Whitfield rose to present Patricia's opening statement, and I had to admit he was more skilled than I had expected from a small-town practitioner. His presentation was polished, his narrative compelling, and his strategy devastatingly effective. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is about a family torn apart by one member's abuse of power. Rebecca Morrison has spent her entire adult life accumulating authority and influence, rising to the highest levels of our judicial system. But power without accountability leads to corruption, and corruption without consequences leads to tragedy." He painted a picture of Dad as a vulnerable elderly man, isolated from his family by a daughter who had gradually assumed control over every aspect of his life. He described my visits to Cedar Falls as calculated interventions designed to manipulate Dad's decision-making, my assumption of power of attorney as a strategic takeover of his autonomy, and my involvement in the sale of the hardware store as evidence of financial exploitation. The evidence will show, Whitfield continued, that Harold Morrison's mental capacity has been declining for months, that he has been confused about basic financial concepts, and that Rebecca Morrison has taken advantage of his condition to advance her own interests at the expense of her siblings and her father's welfare. He called Patricia as his first witness, and her testimony was masterfully crafted to evoke sympathy while delivering maximum damage. She spoke tearfully about Dad's confusion during recent family gatherings, his difficulty remembering recent conversations, his apparent fear of contradicting me when I was present. "He's just not the same person," she said, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. "He used to be so decisive, so clear about what he wanted. But lately, whenever Rebecca calls or visits, he gets agitated. He keeps asking if she's going to be angry with him, like he's afraid of disappointing her." It was a compelling performance, made more effective by the grain of truth embedded within it. Dad had been more tired lately, more careful about his words, more concerned about making mistakes. But Patricia was presenting these normal signs of aging as evidence of cognitive decline, and worse, as proof that I was somehow responsible for his distress. Michael testified next, describing phone conversations in which Dad had expressed confusion about financial matters and uncertainty about decisions he had previously seemed confident about. Jennifer followed with similar stories, each carefully chosen to support the narrative of a declining elderly man being manipulated by his ambitious daughter. But then Marcus Webb began his cross-examination, and the weakness in their case started to show. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said, addressing Michael, "when did these conversations about your father's confusion take place?" "Over the past few months, mostly." "And were these conversations initiated by you, or did your father call you to express these concerns?" Michael hesitated. "Well, I called him to check on him." "How often do you typically call your father?" "Maybe once a week or so." "And before these past few months, when you called once a week, did your father ever express confusion about financial matters?" "Not really, no." So this alleged confusion coincided with increased attention from his children about his mental state? "I guess you could say that." Marcus moved in for the kill. "Mr. Morrison, is it possible that your father's expressions of uncertainty weren't symptoms of cognitive decline, but rather responses to repeated questioning about his competency?" Whitfield objected, but the damage was done. Marcus had revealed what anyone who had worked with elderly clients understood, that constant questions about mental capacity can create anxiety and self-doubt in people who are otherwise perfectly competent. The pattern continued throughout the morning. Each of Patricia's witnesses had compelling anecdotes about Dad's recent behavior, but under cross-examination, it became clear that these incidents had occurred during a period when the family was actively questioning his mental state and discussing their concerns about my influence. Marcus was systematically demonstrating that their evidence proved correlation, not causation. Dad might have seemed confused and uncertain lately, but that was because his children had spent months treating him like he was confused and uncertain. The afternoon brought Patricia's expert witness, Dr. Gerald Hoffman, a geriatric psychiatrist who testified that Dad's described behavior was consistent with early-stage dementia and made him vulnerable to manipulation by family members with legal training. But Dr. Hoffman had never examined Dad. His testimony was based entirely on second-hand accounts from family members, and Marcus eviscerated his credibility with surgical precision. "Doctor, you're asking this court to accept a diagnosis of cognitive impairment based on family members' descriptions of behavior, is that correct?" "I'm providing my professional opinion about the patterns described in the testimony, but you've never spoken to Harold Morrison yourself?" "No, but the symptoms described are quite typical. Doctor, would you diagnose any patient with dementia without a personal examination?" "Well, no, but this is a legal proceeding, not a clinical setting." "So your testimony is speculation, not diagnosis?" "I would characterize it as informed professional opinion based on available information. Information provided by people who are not medical professionals and who have a financial interest in the outcome of this case." Whitfield's objection was sustained, but again the point had been made. Patricia's expert was offering opinions about a man he had never met, based on descriptions from people whose credibility was questionable. As the day wore on, I began to see the deeper strategy behind Patricia's case. She wasn't really trying to prove that Dad was incompetent. She was trying to create enough doubt about his decision-making capacity to justify court intervention. She didn't need to win decisively. She just needed to muddy the waters enough to convince Judge Sullivan that ongoing supervision was warranted. It was a clever approach, but it had one fatal flaw. It assumed that Dad would be a passive participant in his own defense. Patricia had built her entire case around the premise that he was too confused or too intimidated to speak for himself effectively. She was about to discover how wrong that assumption was. When court recessed for the day, I found myself face-to-face with Patricia for the first time since the lawsuit began. We ended up in the courthouse elevator together, an awkward encounter that neither of us had anticipated. "You know this isn't personal, Rebecca," she said as the doors closed, her voice carrying the same tone of reasonable concern she had used during her testimony. "Of course it's personal, Patricia. You're trying to destroy my career based on lies you know are false. I'm trying to protect our father from someone who sees him as a stepping stone to more power and influence." "What power? What influence? I'm already on the Supreme Court. There's nowhere higher to go." She turned to look at me directly for the first time. "There's always somewhere higher for people like you. Another case to win, another precedent to set, another way to prove you're smarter than everyone else." "And what about people like you, Patricia? What are you trying to prove?" The elevator dinged, and the doors opened before she could answer, but her expression at that moment told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about Dad's welfare, or my alleged manipulation. This was about 30 years of accumulated resentment finally finding an outlet, 30 years of feeling overshadowed by a sister who had refused to stay in her assigned place. Tomorrow, Dad would take the stand, and the real battle would begin. Patricia thought she had built an unassailable case, but she had made one crucial miscalculation. She had forgotten that Harold Morrison had been winning arguments with stubborn people for 78 years, and he wasn't about to start losing now. Harold Morrison entered the courtroom at exactly 9 a.m. wearing his best suit, the charcoal gray one he'd bought for my Supreme Court confirmation ceremony, and had worn only twice since. His walk was slower than I remembered, his arthritis clearly bothering him, but his posture was straight and his eyes were sharp. He moved with the deliberate dignity of a man who had something important to say and intended to be heard. The gallery fell silent as he made his way to the witness stand. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The alleged victim finally speaking for himself. The media had spent 2 days speculating about his mental state, legal experts had debated his competency on cable news, and Patricia's entire case rested on the premise that he was too confused or intimidated to make his own decisions. None of them knew Harold Morrison the way I did. Judge Sullivan administered the oath with particular solemnity, perhaps recognizing that this testimony would likely determine the outcome of the case. Dad placed his hand on the Bible and spoke his oath in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Marcus Webb rose to conduct the direct examination, but Dad stopped him before he could ask the first question. "Your Honor," Dad said, addressing Judge Sullivan directly, "I appreciate Mr. Webb's help, but I'd like to speak for myself if that's all right with you." Judge Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Morrison, you have the right to counsel, and I would strongly recommend. I've been making my own decisions for 78 years, Your Honor. I figure I can handle a few more questions." The judge looked at Marcus, who nodded his consent, then back at Dad. "Very well, Mr. Morrison. I'll allow you to proceed, but your attorney can object if necessary." Dad settled back in the witness chair and looked directly at Patricia for the first time since entering the courtroom. His expression wasn't angry or hurt. It was disappointed, which was somehow worse. "Patricia," he said, "I know you think you're protecting me, but what you're really doing is trying to punish your sister for being successful. And I won't stand for it." James Whitfield immediately objected. "Your Honor, the witness is making argumentative statements." "Overruled," Judge Sullivan said. "The witness has chosen to represent himself. I'll allow him some latitude." Dad nodded his thanks to the judge and continued. "I want to address the allegations in this lawsuit directly, because they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am and what I'm capable of." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind he'd used for 40 years to track inventory and customer orders at the hardware store. I've been keeping detailed records of every conversation, every decision, and every financial transaction that my daughter Patricia has questioned. Not because I'm paranoid, but because I could see where this was heading months ago. The courtroom stirred. Patricia's lawyers exchanged concerned glances. This wasn't the confused, manipulated elderly man they had described in their opening statements. First, let's talk about my mental capacity, Dad continued, consulting his notebook. Dr. Kovac examined me on October 15th, 3 weeks ago. I scored 29 out of 30 on the cognitive assessment test. The one point I missed was because I couldn't remember what I had for breakfast, which seems reasonable since I don't usually eat breakfast. A few people in the gallery chuckled, but Dad remained serious. Second, let's discuss the power of attorney. I gave Rebecca that authority on March 12th of this year, after consulting with Robert Chen at the bank, my attorney, David Walsh, and my tax preparer, Margaret Foster. All three of them recommended that I choose the family member with the most experience handling complex financial and legal matters. That's Rebecca. He flipped a page in his notebook. I did not give power of attorney to Patricia because she once tried to convince me that a certificate of deposit was the same thing as a savings account. I did not give it to Michael because he thinks estate planning means buying life insurance. I did not give it to Jennifer because she's never balanced a checkbook in her life. The bluntness of these statements was vintage Harold Morrison. No malice, just practical assessment of facts. Third, regarding the sale of the hardware store. That decision was mine alone. I'm 78 years old, I have arthritis in both hands, and I can barely lift a box of screws without pain. The store was losing money because I couldn't keep up with the physical demands, and Michael made it clear he wasn't interested in taking over the business. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. This narrative was very different from the one her lawyers had presented. I sold the store to Brad Peterson for $180,000, which was actually more than the assessed value. I used that money to pay off my mortgage, set aside funds for long-term care, and establish a small trust fund for my grandchildren's education. Rebecca had nothing to do with that decision except helping me understand the tax implications. Dad closed his notebook and looked directly at Judge Sullivan. Your Honor, I understand that my children are concerned about my welfare, but their concern doesn't give them the right to override my decisions just because they don't agree with them. James Whitfield rose for cross-examination, but he was clearly rattled. His entire case had been built around the premise of diminished capacity, and Dad had just demolished that foundation with methodical precision. Mr. Morrison, Whitfield began carefully, your daughter Patricia testified that you've seemed confused lately, that you've expressed uncertainty about financial matters. That's true, Dad interrupted. I have been confused. I've been confused about why my children started treating me like I was senile just because I made decisions they didn't like. But you did express uncertainty about some of your financial decisions. I expressed uncertainty about whether my decisions would make my children happy. That's not the same thing as not understanding the decisions themselves. Whitfield tried several more approaches, but each one met with the same result. Dad acknowledged moments of uncertainty and confusion, but he contextualized them in ways that supported his competency rather than undermining it. The most devastating moment came when Whitfield attempted to suggest that I had pressured Dad into certain decisions. Mr. Morrison, isn't it true that you were afraid to disagree with Rebecca because of her position and authority? Dad was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him considering his words carefully. Mr. Whitfield, I raised 4 children, ran a business for 40 years, and served on the city council for 12 years. I've never been afraid to disagree with anybody about anything, including presidents and governors and federal judges. He paused, then continued with a slight smile. If you don't believe me, ask Rebecca about the argument we had when she wanted to buy a hybrid car. I told her it was a waste of money, she told me I was stuck in the past, and we didn't speak for 3 weeks. Does that sound like someone who's intimidated by her position? Even Judge Sullivan smiled at that. When Whitfield finished his cross-examination, Marcus Webb stood for redirect, but Dad waved him off. I think I've said what I need to say, Your Honor, but I do have one more thing. Judge Sullivan nodded for him to continue. Patricia, Michael, Jennifer, I love you all. But you're wrong about Rebecca. And you're wrong about me. Rebecca didn't manipulate me or take advantage of me. She did what good children do. She helped when I asked for help, and she respected my decisions even when she didn't agree with them. His voice grew stronger. I chose Rebecca to handle my affairs because she's the most qualified, not because she forced me to. I trust her judgment because she's proven it reliable over 30 years, not because I'm too confused to know better. And I support her career because I'm proud of what she's accomplished, not because I'm afraid of her power. He stood up from the witness chair, his movement careful but determined. This lawsuit is an embarrassment to our family and an insult to everything I've taught you about treating people with respect. I want it dropped, and I want an apology to your sister. The courtroom was completely silent. Patricia was staring at the table in front of her, tears streaming down her face. Michael and Jennifer looked like they wanted to disappear. Even Whitfield seemed stunned by the force of Dad's testimony. Judge Sullivan called a brief recess, and during the break, I watched Patricia have an intense conversation with her legal team. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told the story. The case was over, and everyone knew it. When court reconvened, Whitfield stood to address the judge. Your Honor, in light of the testimony we've heard today, my client would like to withdraw her complaint and dismiss this lawsuit with prejudice. Mrs. Chen, Judge Sullivan said, is this your decision? Patricia stood slowly, her voice barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that dismissing with prejudice means you cannot refile these allegations? I understand. Judge Sullivan looked around the courtroom, her expression suggesting she had seen enough family drama for one lifetime. Very well. The complaint is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Morrison will retain his power of attorney, and there will be no further court supervision of his affairs. She paused, then added, I would suggest that this family might benefit from some private conversations about respect and communication, but that's beyond the jurisdiction of this court. As the gavel fell, I felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and sadness. I had won the case, but the victory felt hollow. My relationship with my siblings was probably irreparable, and the public attention had been humiliating for everyone involved. But as I gathered my papers and prepared to leave the courtroom, Dad appeared beside me. Rebecca, I want you to know that I've never been prouder of you than I am right now. Why? Because I won the case? No, he said, because you fought for what was right even when it cost you something. That's what integrity looks like. As we walked out of the courthouse together, past the cameras and reporters and curious onlookers, I realized that this battle had given me something I'd been missing for 30 years. The unconditional support of the parent who mattered most. Patricia might never understand me, and my siblings might never forgive me for refusing to diminish myself to make them comfortable. But Dad finally saw me for who I really was, and he approved. Patricia way dearie, that was worth fighting for. 6 months after the courthouse victory, I stood in my Supreme Court chambers holding a letter that had arrived that morning. The return address was Cedar Falls, Iowa, but the handwriting wasn't Dad's. It was from Jennifer. I finished reading the letter as the sun set over the Potomac, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of Iowa sunsets from my childhood. Tomorrow, I would return to the business of interpreting the Constitution, making decisions that would affect millions of Americans, writing opinions that would shape the law for generations to come. But tonight, I would call Dad and tell him about Jennifer's letter. I would share this small moment of family reconciliation with the one person who would understand what it meant. Asmanuz aksilo makatolstaka. The trial had been painful, but it had also been necessary. It had forced my family to confront 30 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. It had compelled me to defend not just my actions but my choices, my values, my entire approach to life. And in the end, it had given me something I'd never expected: the respect of the people who mattered most, earned not through compromise or accommodation, but through the simple act of being authentically myself. As I prepared to leave my chambers for the evening, I looked one more time at the photo on my desk, Dad and me after the trial, standing on the courthouse steps. He was smiling with genuine pride, and for the first time in any family photo, I looked like I belonged exactly where I was. Some battles are worth fighting, even when they cost you everything you thought you wanted. Because sometimes, what you get in return is everything you actually needed. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.